Dutch Fairy Tales for Young Folks. The Curly-Tailed Lion. Once upon a time, some Dutch hunters went to Africa, hoping to capture a whole family of lions. In this they succeeded, with a pack of hounds and plenty of aborigines to poke the jungle with sticks. They drove a big male lion, with his wife, and 4 whelps, out of the undergrowth into a circle. In the center, they had dug a pit and covered it over with sticks and grass. Into this, the whole lion family tumbled. Then, by nets and ropes, the big, fierce creatures and the little cubs were lifted out. They were put in cages and brought to Holland. The baby lions, no bigger than pug dogs, were as pretty and harmless as kittens. The sailors delighted to play with them. Now lions, even before one was ever seen, among the Dutch, enjoyed a great reputation for strength, courage, dignity and power. It was believed that they had all the traits of character supposed to belong to kings, and which boys like to possess. Many fathers had named their sons Leo, which is Latin for lion. Dutch daddies had their baby boys christened with the name of Leeuw, which is their word for the king of beasts. Before lions were brought from the hot countries into colder lands, the bear and wolf were most admired because, besides possessing plenty of fur, as well as great claws and terrible teeth, they had great courage. For these reasons, many royal and common folks had taken the wolf and bear as namesakes for their hopeful sons. But the male lion could make more noise than wolves, for he could roar while they could only howl. He had a shaggy mane and a very long tail. This had a nail at the end, for scratching and combing out his hair when tangled up. If he were angry, the mighty brute could stick out his red tongue, curled like a pump handle, and nearly half a yard long. So the lion was called the king of beasts, and the crowned rulers and knights took him as their emblem. They had pictures of the huge creature painted on their flags, shields and armor. Sometimes they stuck a gold or brass lion on their iron war hats, which they called helmets. No knight was allowed to have more than 1 lion on his shield, but kings might have 3 or 4, or even a whole menagerie of meat-eating creatures. These painted or sculptured lions were in all sorts of action, running, walking, standing up and looking behind or before. Now there was a Dutch artist who noticed what funny fellows kings were, and how they liked to have all sorts of beasts, and birds of prey, and sea creatures that devour, on their banners. There were dragons, 2-headed eagles, boars with tusks, serpents with fangs, hawks, griffins, wyverns, lions, dragons and dragon lions, besides horses with wings, mermaids with scaly tails, and even nightmares that went flying through the dark. With such a funny variety of beast, bird, and fish, some wondered why there were not cows with 2 tails, cats with 2 noses, rams with 4 horns, and creatures that were half veal and half mutton. He noticed that kings did not care much for tame, quiet, peaceable, or useful creatures, such as oxen or horses, doves or sheep, but only for those brutes that hunt and kill the more defenseless creatures. Since, then, kings of the country must have a lion, the artist resolved to make a new one. He would have some fun, at any rate. So his painter or sculptor select men and women to pose for them in their study, as their heroes and heroines. And just as they picture plump little boys and girls as cherubs and angels, so the Dutchman would make of the cubs and the father beast of prey his models for coats of arms. Poor lions, they did not know, but they soon found out how tiresome it was to pose. They must hold their paws up, down, sideways or behind, according as they were told. They must stand or kneel, for a long time, in awkward positions. They must stick out their tongues to full length, walk on their hind legs, twist their necks, to one side or the other, look forward or backward, and in many tiresome ways do just as they were ordered. They must also make of their tails every sort of use, whether to wrap around posts or bundles, to stick out of their cage, or put between their legs, as they ran away, or to whisk them around, as they roared, or hoist them up high when rampant. In some cases they were expected, even, to put on spectacles, and pretend to be reading, to hold in their paws books and scrolls, or town arms, or shop signs. They must pose, not only as companions of Daniel, in the lion's den at Babylon, which was proper, but also to sit, as companion of Saint Mark, and even to stand on their legs. on the top of a high column, without falling off. In a word, this artist belonged to the College of Heralds. And he introduced the King of Beasts into Dutch heraldry. So from that day forth, the life of that family of African lions, from the daddy to the youngest cub, was made a burden. When at home in the jungle and even in the cage, the father lion's favorite position was that of lolling on one side, with his paws stretched out, and half asleep and all day, until he went out, towards dark, to hunt. Now, he must stand up, nearly all day. Daddy Lion had to do most of the posing, until the poor beast's front legs and paws were weary with standing so long. Moreover, the hair was all worn off his body at the place where he had to sit on the hard wooden floor. He must do all this, on penalty of being punched with a red hot poker if he refused. A charcoal furnace and long andirons were kept nearby, and these were attended to by a Dutch boy. Or, it might be that the whole family of lions were not allowed to have any dinner till Daddy obeyed, and did what he was told, though often with a snarl or a roar. First, Leo must rise upon his hind legs and look in front of him. This posture was not hard, for in his native jungle, he had often thus obtained a breakfast of venison for his wife and family. But oh, to stand a half-hour on 2 legs only, when he had 4, and would gladly have used all of them, was hard. Yet this was the position, called the lion rampant, which kings liked best. But the king's uncles, nephews, nieces, cousins, and his wife's relations generally, every one of them, wanted a lion on his or her stationery and pocket handkerchiefs, as well as on their shields and flags. So the old lion was tortured, the hot poker being always in sight, and he was made to take a great variety of positions. The artist called out to Leo, just as a driver says to his cart horse, "Whoa, get up, go long," etc. When he yelled in this fashion, the lion had to obey. Pretty soon lions in heraldry, on flags, armor, town arms, family crests and city seals became all the fashion. The whole country went lion mad. There were lions carved in stone, wood and iron, and every sort and kind, possible or impossible. Some of them seemed to be engaged in a variety of tricks, as if they belonged to a circus, or were having a holiday. They laughed, giggled, yawned, stuck out their tongues, held boards for hotels, bundles for the shopkeepers or barrels for beer halls, and made excellent shop signs, which the boys and girls enjoyed looking at. Mrs. Leo was not in much demand, for Mr. Leo did not approve of his wife's appearing in public. She was kept busy in taking care of her cubs. Daddy Lion had to do multiple work for his family, until the cubs were grown. Yet long before this time had come, their dad had died and been stuffed for a museum. How this first king of beasts in the Netherlands came to his untimely end was on this wise. Not satisfied with posing Leo in every posture, and with all possible gestures, his master, the artist, wanted him to look heraldical, that is, like some of the mythical beasts that were combinations of any and all creatures, having fins, fur, feathers, or scales, such as the dragon or griffin. One day, he attempted to make out of a live lion a fanciful creature of curlicues and curliewurlies. So he strapped the lion down, and used a curling iron on his mane, until he looked like a bearded bull of Babylon. Then he combed out, and, with curl papers, twisted the long line of hair, which is seen in front of Leo's stomach. In like manner, he treated the bunches of hair that grow over the animal's knee-pans and elbows. Last of all, he took a hairbrush, and smoothed out the tuft at the end of the animal's long tail. Then the artist made a picture of him in this condition, all curled and rich in ringlets, like a dandy. By this time, the father of the lion family looked as if he had come out fresh from a hairdresser's parlor. Indeed, Mrs. Leo was so struck with her husband's appearance, that she immediately licked her cubs all over, until their fur shone, so they should look like their father. Then, having used her tongue as a comb, to make her own skin smooth and glossy, she completed the job by using the nail in her tail to do the finishing work. Altogether, this was the curliest family of lions ever seen, and Daddy Leo appeared to be the funniest curly-headed and curly-bodied lion ever seen. In fact, he was all curls, from head to tail. Notwithstanding all his pains, the artist was not yet satisfied with his job. He wanted a circle of long hair to grow in the middle of the lion's tail. His curly lion should beat all creation, and in this way he proceeded. His own daughter, being a young lady and having some trouble of the throat. The doctor had ordered medicine for the girl, charging her not to spill any drops of the liquid on her face or clothes. But, in giving the dose, either the mother or the daughter was careless. At that very moment the cat ran across the room, after the mouse. And just as she held the spoon to her mouth, Puss got twisted in her skirts. So most of the medicine splashed upon her upper lip, and then ran down to her chin, on either side of her mouth. She laughed over the spill, wiped off the liquid, and thought no more of the matter. But a week later, she was astonished. On waking, she looked in the glass, only to shrink back in horror. On her face had grown both mustaches and a beard. True, both were rather downy, but still they were black and, until the barber came, and shaved off the growth, she was a bearded woman. Yet, strange to tell, after 1 or 2 shaves by the barber, no more hair grew again on her face, which was smooth again. By Saint Servetus, I'll make a fortune on this, cried the artist, when he saw his daughter's hairy face. So, he sold his secret to a druggist, and this man made an ointment, giving it a Chinese name, meaning, beard grower. This wonderful medicine, as his sign declared, would force the growth of luxuriant mustaches and a beard on the smoothest face of any young man who should buy and apply it. Soon the whole town rang with the news of the wonderful discovery. The druggist sold out his stock, in 2 days, to happy purchasers. Other young fellows, that wanted to outrival their companions, had to wait a fortnight for the new medicine to be made. By that time, a full crop of downy hair had come out on the cheeks and chin and upper lip of many a youth. Some, who had been trying for years to raise mustaches, in order duly to impress the girls, to whom they were making love, were now jubilant. In several cases, a lover was able to cut out his rival and win the maid he wanted. Several courtings were hastened and became genuine matches, because a face, long very smooth, and like a desert as to hair, bore a promising crop. Beard and cheeks had at last met together. So the new medicine was called a matchmaker. The artist rubbed his hands in glee at the prospect of a fortune. He argued that if the wonderful ointment made beards for men, it must be good for lions also. So again, Daddy Lion was coerced by the threat of the hot poker. Then his tail was seized, and, by means of a rope, tied to a post on one side of the cage, he was held fast. Then the artist anointed about 6 inches of the middle of the smooth tail with the magic liquid. For fear the lion might lick it off, the poor beast was held in this tiresome position for a whole week, so that he could not turn round, and he nearly died of fatigue. But it happened to the lion's tail, as it did with the young men's chins, cheeks and upper lips. A beard did indeed grow, but once shaved off, and many did shave, thinking to promote greater growth, no more hair ever appeared again. The ointment forced a downy growth, but it killed the roots of the hair. A worse fate befell the lion. A crop of hair, perhaps an inch longer than common, grew out. But this time, the bad medicine, which had deceived men, and was unfit for lions, struck in. From this cause, added to nervous prostration, old Leo fell dead. As lion fathers go, he was a good one, and his widow and children mourned for him. He had never once, however hungry, tried to eat up his cubs, which was something in his favor. Soon after these exploits, the old artist died also. His son, hearing there was still a demand, among kings, for lions, and those especially with center curls in their tails, took the most promising of the whelps and petted and fed him well. In the 7th year, when his mane and elbow and knee hair had grown out, this cub was mated to a young lioness of like promise. When, of this couple, a male whelp was born, it was found that in due time, its knees, elbows, tail tuft, and the front of its body were all rich in furry growth. In the middle of its tail, also, thick ringlets, several inches long, were growing. Evidently, the hair tonic had done some good. So this one became the father of all the curly-tailed lions in the Netherlands. Not only was this lion, thus distinguished for so novel an ornament, copied into heraldry, but it adorned many city seals and town arms. In time, the Lion of the Netherlands was pictured with a crown on its head. a sword in its right hand, a bundle of 7 arrows, in token of a union of 7 states, and, still later, the new order of the Netherlands lion was founded. The original curly lion, with long hair in the middle of its tail, boasts of a long line of descendants that are proud of their ancestor. Brabo and the giant. Ages ago, when the giants were numerous on the earth, there lived a big fellow named Antigonus. That was not what his mother had called him, but someone told him of a Greek general of that name, so he took this for his own. He was rough and cruel. His castle was on the Scheldt River, where the city of Antwerp now stands. Many ships sailed out of France and Holland down this stream. They were loaded with timber, flax, iron, cheese, fish, bread, linen, and other things made in the country. It was by this trade that many merchants grew rich, and their children had plenty of toys to play with. The river was very grand, deep, and wide. The captains of the ships liked to sail on it, because there was no danger from rocks, and the country through which it flowed was so pretty. So every day, one could see hundreds of white-sailed craft moving towards the sea, or coming in from the ocean. Boys and girls came down to stand in their wooden shoes on the banks, to see the vessels moving to and fro. The incoming ships brought sugar, wine, oranges, lemons, olives and other good things to eat, and wool to make warm clothes. Often craftsmen came from the wonderful countries in the south, to tell of the rich cities there, and help to build new and fine houses, and splendid churches, and town halls. So all the Belgian people were happy. But one day, this wicked giant came into the country to stop the ships and make them pay him money. He reared a strong castle on the river banks. It had 4 sides and high walls, and deep down in the earth were dark, damp dungeons. One had to light a candle to find his way to the horrid places. What was it all for? The people wondered, but they soon found out. The giant, with a big knotted club, made out of an oak tree, strode through the town. He cried out to all the people to assemble in the great open square. From this day forth, he roared, "No ship, whether up or down the river, shall pass by this place, without my permission. Every captain must pay me toll, in money or goods. Whoever refuses, shall have both his hands cut off and thrown into the river. Hear ye all and obey. Anyone caught in helping a ship go by without paying toll, whether it be night, or whether it be day, shall have his thumbs cut off and be put in the dark dungeon for a month. Again I say, obey." With this, the giant swung and twirled his club aloft and then brought it down on a poor countryman's cart, smashing it into flinders. This was done to show his strength. So every day, when the ships hove in sight, they were hailed from the giant's castle and made to pay heavy toll. Poor or rich, they had to hand over their money. If any captain refused, he was brought ashore and made to kneel before a block and place one hand upon the other. Then the giant swung his axe and cut off both hands, and flung them into the river. If a shipmaster hesitated, because he had no money, he was cast into a dungeon, until his friends paid his ransom. Soon, on account of this, the city got a bad name. The captains from France kept in, and the shipmen from Spain kept out. The merchants found their trade dwindling, and they grew poorer every day. So some of them slipped out of the city and tried to get the ships to sail in the night, and silently pass the giant's castle. But the giant's watchers on the towers were as wide awake as owls and greedy as hawks. They pounced on the ship captains, chopped off their hands and tossed them into the river. The townspeople, who were found on board, were thrown into the dungeons and had their thumbs cut off. So the prosperity of the city was destroyed, for the foreign merchants were afraid to send their ships into the giant's country. The reputation of the city grew worse. It was nicknamed by the Germans hand-werpen, or hand-throwing, while the Dutchmen called it Antwerp, which meant the same thing. The Duke of Brabant, or Lord of the land, came to the big fellow's fortress and told him to stop. He even shook his fist under the giant's huge nose, and threatened to attack his castle and burn it. But Antigonus only snapped his fingers, and laughed at him. He made his castle still stronger and kept on hailing ships, throwing some of the crews into dungeons and cutting off the hands of the captains, until the fish in the river grew fat. Now there was a brave young fellow named Brabo, who lived in the province of Brabant. He was proud of his country and her flag of yellow, black and red, and was loyal to his lord. He studied the castle well and saw a window, where he could climb up into the giant's chamber. Going to the Duke, Brabo promised if his lord's soldiers would storm the gates of the giant's castle, that he would seek out and fight the ruffian. While they battered down the gates, he would climb the walls. "He's nothing but a buell whack, a bully and a boaster," said Brabo, "and we ought to call him that, instead of Antigonus." The Duke agreed. On a dark night, 1,000 of his best men at arms were marched with their banners. But with no drums or trumpets, or anything that could make a noise and alarm the watchmen. Reaching a wood full of big trees near the castle, they waited till after midnight. All the dogs in the town and country, for 5 miles around, were seized and put into barns, so as not to bark and wake the giant up. They were given plenty to eat, so that they quickly fell asleep and were perfectly quiet. At the given signal, hundreds of men holding ships' masts, or tree trunks, marched against the gates. They punched and pounded and at last smashed the iron-bound timbers and rushed in. After overcoming the garrison, they lighted candles, and unlocking the dungeons, went down and set the poor half-starved captives free. Some of them, pale, haggard and thin as hop poles, could hardly stand. About the same time, the barn doors where the dogs had been kept, were thrown open. In full cry, a regiment of the animals, from puppies to hounds, were at once out, barking, baying and yelping, as if they knew what was going on and wanted to see the fun. But where was the giant? None of the captains could find him. Not one of the prisoners or the garrison could tell where he had hid. But Brabo knew that the big fellow, Antigonus, was not at all brave, but really only a bully and a coward. So the lad was not afraid. Some of his comrades outside helped him to set up a tall ladder against the wall. Then, while all the watchers and men at arms inside had gone away to defend the gates, Brabo climbed into the castle, through a slit in the thick wall. This had been cut out, like a window, for the bow and arrow men, and was usually occupied by a sentinel. Sword in hand, Brabo made for the giant's own room. Glaring at the youth, the big fellow seized his club and brought it down with such force that it went through the wooden floor. But Brabo dodged the blow and, in a trice, made a sweep with his sword. Cutting off the giant's head, he threw it out the window. It had hardly touched the ground before the dogs arrived. One of the largest of these ran away with the trophy, and the big, hairy noddle of the bully was never found again. But the giant's huge hands. They were cut off by Brabo, who stood on the very top of the highest tower, while all below looked up and cheered. Brabo laid one big hand on top of the other, as the giant used to do, when he cut off the hands of captains. He took first the right hand and then the left hand and threw them, one at a time, into the river. A pretty sight now revealed the fact that the people knew what had been going on and were proud of Brabo's valor. In a moment, every house in Antwerp showed lighted candles, and the city was illuminated. Issuing from the gates came a company of maidens. They were dressed in white, but their leader was robed in yellow, red, and black, the colors of the Brabant flag. They all sang in chorus the praises of Brabo, their hero. "Let us now drop the term of disgrace to the city, that of the hand-throwing, and give it a new name," said one of the leading men of Antwerp. "No," said the chief ruler, "let us rather keep the name, and, more than ever, invite all peaceful ships to come again, and werf, at the wharf, as of old. Then, let the arms of Antwerp be 2 red hands above a castle." "Agreed," cried the citizens with a great shout. The Duke of Brabant approved and gave new privileges to the city, on account of Brabo's bravery. So, from high to low, all rejoiced to honor their hero, who was richly rewarded. After this, thousands of ships, from many countries, loaded or unloaded their cargoes on the wharves, or sailed peacefully by. Antwerp excelled all seaports and became very rich again. Her people loved their native city so dearly, that they coined the proverb, "All the world is a ring, and Antwerp is the pearl set in it." To this day, in the great square, rises the splendid bronze monument of Brabo the Brave. The headless and handless hulk of the giant Antigonus lies sprawling, while on his body rests Antwerp Castle. Standing over all, at the top, is Brabo high in air. He holds one of the hands of Antigonus, which he is about to toss into the Scheldt River. No people honor valor more than the Belgians. Themselves are today, as of old, among the bravest. Farm that ran away and came back. There was once a Dutchman who lived in the province called Drenthe. Because there was a row of little trees on his farm, his name was Ryer van Boompjes, that is, Ryer of the Little Trees. After a while, he moved to the shore of the Zuiderzee and into Overijssel. Overijssel means over the Ijssel River. There he bought a new farm, near the village of Bloksel. By digging and pumping, certain wise men had changed 10 acres, of sand and heath, into pasture and land for plowing. They surrounded it on 3 sides with canals. The 4th side fronted on the Zuiderzee. Then they advertised, in glowing language, the merits of the new land, and Ryer van Boompjes bought it and paid for his real estate. He was as proud as a popinjay of his island, and he ruled over it like a czar or a kaiser. A few years before, Ryer had married a kwezel, as the Dutch call either a nun, or a maid who is no longer young. At this date, when our story begins, he had 4 blooming, but old-fashioned children, with good appetites. They could eat cabbage and potatoes, rye bread and cheese, by the half-pack, and drink buttermilk by the quart. In addition, Ryer owned 4 horses, 6 cows, 2 dogs, some roosters and hens, a flock of geese, 2 dozen ducks, and a donkey. Yet although Ryer was rich, as wealth is reckoned in Drenthe, whence he had come, he was greedy for more. He skimped the food of his animals. So much did he do this, that his neighbors declared that they had seen him put green spectacles on his cows and the donkey. Then he mixed straws and shavings with the hay to make the animals think they were eating fresh grass. When he plowed, he drove his horses close to the edge next to the water, so as to make use of every half-inch of land. When sometimes bits of fenland, from his neighbors' farms, got loose and floated on the water, Ryer felt he was in luck. He would go out at night, grapple the boggy stuff and fasten it to his own land. After this had happened several times, and Ryer had added a half-acre to his holdings, his greed possessed him like a bad fairy. He began to steal the land on the other side of the Zuiderzee. In the course of time, he became a regular land thief. Whenever he saw or heard of a floating bit of territory, he rowed his boat after it by night. Before morning, aided by wicked helpers, who shared in the plunder, and were in his pay, he would have the bog attached to his own farm. All this time, he hardly realized that his ill-gotten property, now increased to 12 acres or more, was itself a very shaky bit of real estate. In fact, it was not real at all. His wife one day told him so, for she knew of her mean husband's trickery. About this time, heavy rains fell, for many days, and without ceasing, until all the region was reduced to pulp and the country seemed afloat. The dikes appeared ready to burst. Thousands feared that the land had an attack of the disease called Val Fall, and that the soil would sink under the waves as portions of the realm had done before, in days long gone by. Yet none of this impending trouble worried Ryer, whose greed grew by what it fed upon. In fact, the first day the sun shone again, quickly drying up parts of his farm, he had 2 horses harnessed up for work. Then he drove them so near the edge of the ditch that plow, man, and horses tumbled, and down they went, into the shiny mess of mud and water. At this moment, also, the water, from below the bottom of the Zuiderzee, welled up, in a great wave, like a mushroom, and the whole of Ryer's soggy estate was on the point of breaking loose and seemed ready to float away. The stingy fellow, as he fell overboard, bumped his head so hard on the plow beam, that he lay senseless for a half-hour. He would certainly have been drowned, had not Pete, his stout son, who was not far away, and had seen the tumble, ran to the house, launched a boat and rowed quickly to the spot, where he had last seen his father. Grabbing his daddy by the collar, he hauled him, half dead, into the boat. Between his bump and his fright, and the cold bath, old Ryer was a long time coming to his wits. With filial piety, Pete kept on rubbing the paternal hands and restoring the circulation. All this, however, took a long time, even an hour or more. When his father was able to sit up and talk, Pete started to row back to the little wharf in front of his home. But where was it, the farm, with the house and fields? Whither had they gone? Ryer was too mystified to get his bearings. But Pete knew the points of the compass. Yet his father's farm was not there. He looked at the shore of Overijssel, which he had left. Instead of the old, straight lines of willow trees, with the church spire beyond, there was a hollow and empty place. It looked as if a giant, as big as the world itself, had bitten out a piece of land and swallowed it down. Dumbfounded, father and son looked, the one at the other, but said nothing, for there was nothing to say. Meanwhile, what had become of the farm and the Queasel, as the neighbors still called her, that is, the mother with the children? These good people soon saw that they were floating off somewhere. The mainland was every moment receding further into the distance. In fact, the farm was moving from Overijssel northward, towards Friesland. One by one, the church spires of the village nearby faded from sight. But when the wind changed from south to west, they seemed as if on a ship, with sails set, and to be making due west, for North Holland. The younger children, so far from being afraid, clapped their hands in glee. They thought it great fun to ferry across the big water, which they had so long seen before their eyes. Their stingy father had never owned a carriage, or allowed the horses to be ridden. He always made his family walk to church. Whether it were to the sermon, in the morning, or to hear the catechism expounded by the domini, in the afternoon. All the family had to tramp on their wooden shoes there and back. As for the floating farm, the cows could not understand it. They mooed piteously, while the donkey brayed loudly. At night, and day after day, no one could attend properly to the animals, to see that they were fed and given water. One always sees a big tub in the middle of a Dutch pasture field. Neither ducks, nor geese, nor chickens minded it in the least, but the thirsty cattle and horses, at the end of the first day, had drunk the tub dry. None of the dumb brutes, even if they had not been afraid of being drowned, could drink from the Zuiderzee. For it was chiefly seawater, that is, salt, or at least brackish. Occasionally this errant farm, that had thus broken loose, passed by fishermen, who wondered at so much land thus adrift. Yet they feared to hail, and go on board, lest the owners might think them intruding. Others thought it none of their business, supposing some crazy fellow was using his farm as a ship, to move his lands, goods and household, and thus save expense. In some of the villages, the runaway farm was descried from the tops of the church towers. Then, it furnished a subject for chat and gossip, during 3 days, to the women, as they milked the cows, or knitted stockings. To the men, also, while they smoked, or drank their coffee, it was a lively topic. There were real people on it in a house and stables, said the sexton of a church, who declared that he had seen this new sort of a Flying Dutchman. It was the usual sight, cow, dog, and stork, and then he quoted the old Dutch proverb. At last, after several days, and when Ryer and his son were nearly finished, with fatigue and fright, in trying to row their boat to catch up with the runaway farm, they finally reached a village across the Zuiderzee, in North Holland, where rye bread and turnips satisfied their hunger and they had waffles for dessert. Their small change went quickly, and then the 2 men were at their wits' end to know what further to do. By this time, out on the floating farm, the mother and children were wild with fear of starving. All the food for the cattle had been eaten up, the dog had no meat, the cat no milk, and the stork had run out of its supply of frogs. There was no sugar or coffee, and neither rye nor currant bread, or sliced sausage or wafer-thin cheese for anyone but only potatoes and some barley grain. Happily, however, in drifting within sight of the village of Oosterbeek, the mother and the children noticed that the east wind was freshening. Soon they descried the tops of the church towers of North Holland. The smell of cows and cheese and of burning peat fires from the chimneys made both animals and human beings happy, as the wind blew the island westward to the village. Curiously enough, this was the very place at which, by hard rowing, Ryer and Pete had also arrived. Father and son were sitting in the hotel parlor, with their eyes down on the sandy floor, wondering how they were to pay for their next sandwich and coffee, for their money was all gone. At that moment, a small boy clattered over the bricks in his klomps. He kicked these off, at the door, and rushed into the room. He had on his yellow baggy trousers and his hair, of the same color, was cut level with his ears. Half out of breath, he announced the coming, afloat, of what looked like a combination of farm and menagerie. A house, a woman, some girls, a dog, a cat, and a stork were on it and afloat. At once, old man Ryer, still stiff from his long, cold bath, hobbled out, and Pete ran before him. Yes, it was mother, the children and all the animals. For the first time in his life, the mean old sinner felt his heart thumping, in grateful emotion, under his woolen jacket, with its 2 gold buttons. Something like real religion had finally oozed out from under his crusted soul. A whole convoy of boys, fishermen, farmers, and a fat vrouw or two volunteered to go out and tow the runaway farm to the village wharf. They succeeded in grappling the float and held it fast by ropes tied to a horse post. That night all were happy. The farm was made fast by another rope put round the town pump. Then the villagers all went to bed. They were happy in having rescued a runaway farm, and they expected a good loon reward from the rich old Ryer, who, in the barroom, had talked big about his wealth. As for the Van Boompjes, in order to save a landlord's bill for beds, they slept in their house, on board the farm, amid the lowing of their cattle that called out, in their own way, for more fodder. While the people in the village wondered at roosters crowing out on the water, and evidently the barnyard birds were frightened. And so they were before midnight, when all other creatures were asleep, and not even a mouse was stirring on land, whether hard fast, or floating. The west wind rose mightily and blew to a terrific gale. In a moment, the tow lines that held the vagrant farm to the village pump and horse post snapped. The Van Boompjes estate left the wharf and was driven, at a furious rate, across the Zuiderzee. For several hours, like a ship under full sail, it was pushed westward by the wind. Yet so soundly did all sleep, man and wife, children and hens, that none awakened during this strange voyage. Even the roosters, after their first concert, held in their voices. Suddenly, and as straight as if steered by a skilled pilot, the Van Boompjes farm, now an accomplished traveler, after its many adventures, shot into its old place. This took place with such violence, that Ryer Van Boompjes and his wife were both thrown out of bed. The cows were knocked over in the stable. The dog barked, supposing someone had kicked him. One old rooster, jostled off his perch, set up a tremendous crowing, that brought some of the early risers out to rub their eyes and see what was going on. Hemel en aarde, bliksem en regen, heaven and earth, lightning and rain, they cried, the old farm is back in its place. In fact, the Van Boompjes' real estate was snugly fitted once more to the mainland, and again in the niche it had left. It had struck so hard that a ridge of raised sod, 5 inches high, marked the place of junction. At least 20 fishes and wriggling eels were smashed in the collision. From that day forth the conscience of Van Boompjes returned, and he actually became an honest man. He sawed off, from time to time, portions of his big farm, and returned them home, with money paid as interest, to the owners. He found out all the mynheers, whose bits of land had drifted off. He sent a tidy sum of gold to the village in North Holland, where his farm had been moored, for a few hours. With a good conscience, he went to church and worshipped. His action, at each of the 2 collections, which Dutch folks always take up on Sundays, was noticed and praised as a sure and public sign of the old sinner's true repentance. When the deacons, with their white gloves on, poked under his nose, their black velvet bags, hung at the end of fishing poles, 10 feet long, this man, who had been for years a skinflint, dropped in a silver coin each time. On the farm, all the animals, from duck to stork, and from dog to ox, now led happier lives. In the family, all declared that the behavior of the farm and the wind of the Zuiderzee had combined to make a new man and a delightful father of old Van Boompjes. He lived long and happily and died greatly lamented. Santa Klaas and Black Pete. Who is Santa Claus? How did he get his name? Where does he live? Did you ever see him? These are questions often asked of the storyteller by little folks. Before Santa Claus came into the Netherlands, that is, to Belgium and Holland, he was called by many names, in the different countries in which he lived, and where he visited. Some people say he was born in Myra, many hundred years ago before the Dutch had a dike or a windmill, or waffles, or wooden shoes. Others tell us how, in time of famine, the good saint found the bodies of 3 little boys, pickled in a tub, at a market for sale, and to be eaten up. They had been salted down to keep till sold. The kind gentleman and saint, whose name was Nicholas, restored these 3 children to life. It is said that once he lost his temper, and struck with his fist a gentleman named Arius, but the storyteller does not believe this, for he thinks it is a fib, made up long afterward. How could a saint lose his temper so? Another story they tell of this same Nicholas was this. There were 3 lovely maidens, whose father had lost all his money. They wanted husbands very badly, but had no money to buy fine clothes to get married in. He took pity on both their future husbands and themselves. So he came to the window, and left 3 bags of gold, one after the other. Thus these 3 real girls all got real husbands, just as the novels tell us of the imaginary ones. They lived happily ever afterward, and never scolded their husbands. By and by, men who were goldsmiths, bankers or pawnbrokers, made a sign of these 3 bags of gold, in the shape of balls. Now they hang them over their shop doors, 2 above 1. This means, 2 to 1, you will never get it again, when you put your ring, furs, or clothes, or watch, or spoons, in pawn. It is ridiculous how many stories they do tell of this good man, Nicholas, who was said to be what they call a bishop, or inspector, who goes around seeing that things are done properly in the churches. It was because the Reverend Mr. Nicholas had to travel about a good deal, that the sailors and travelers built temples and churches in his honor. To travel, one must have a ship on the sea and a horse on the land, or a reindeer up in the cold north. Though now, it is said, he comes to Holland in a steamship, and uses an automobile. On Santa Claus Eve, each of the Dutch children sets out in the chimney his wooden shoe. Into it, he puts a wisp of hay, to feed the traveler's horse. When St. Nicholas first came to Holland, he arrived in a sailing ship from Spain and rode on a horse. Now he arrives in a big steamer, made of steel. Perhaps he will come in the future by aeroplane. To fill all the shoes and stockings, the good saint must have an animal to ride. Now the fast white horse, named Sleipnir, was ready for him, and on Sleipnir's back he made his journeys. How was Santa Claus dressed? His clothes were those of a bishop. He wore a red coat, and his cap, higher than a turban and called a mitre, was split along 2 sides and pointed at the top. In his hands, he held a crozier, which was a staff borrowed from shepherds, who tended sheep, and with the crozier he helped the lambs over rough places. But the crozier of Santa Claus was tipped with gold. He had white hair and rosy cheeks. For an old man, he was very active, but his heart and feelings never got to be one day older than a boy's, for these began when mother love was born and father's care was first in the world, but it never grows old. When Santa Claus traveled up north to Norway and into the icy cold regions, where there were sleighs and reindeer, he changed his clothes. Instead of his red robe, he wears a jacket, much shorter and trimmed with ermine, white as snow. Taking off his mitre, he wears a cap of fur also, and has laid aside his crozier. In the snow, wheels are no good, and runners are the best for swift travel. So, instead of his white horse and a wagon, he drives in a sleigh, drawn by 2 stags with large horns. In every country, he puts into the children's stockings hung up, or shoes set in the fireplace, something which they like. In Greenland, for example, he gives the little folks seal blubber and fish hooks. So his presents are not the same in every country. However, for naughty boys and girls everywhere, instead of filling shoes and stockings, he may leave a switch, or pass them by empty. When Santa Claus travels, he always brings back good things. Now when he first came to New Netherland in America, what did he find to take back to Holland? Well, it was here, on our continent, that he found corn, potatoes, pumpkins, maple sugar, and something to put in pipes to smoke, besides strange birds and animals, such as turkeys and raccoons, in addition to many new flowers. What may be called a weed, like the mullein, for example, is considered very pretty in Europe, where they did not have such things. There it is called the American velvet plant, or the king's candlestick. But, better than all, Santa Claus found a Negro boy, Pete, who became one of the most faithful of his helpers. At Utrecht, in Holland, the students of the university give, every year, a pageant representing Santa Claus on his white horse, with Black Pete, who was always on hand and very busy. Black Pete's father brought peanuts from Africa to America, and sometimes Santa Claus drops a bagful of these, as a great curiosity, into the shoes of the Dutch young folks. Santa Claus was kept very busy visiting the homes and the public schools in New Netherland, for in these schools all the children, girls, as well as boys, and not boys only, received a free education. In later visits he heard of Captain Kidd and his fellow pirates, who wore striped shirts and red caps, and had pigtails of hair, tied in eelskins, and hanging down their backs. These fellows wore earrings and stuck pistols in their belts and daggers at their sides. Instead of getting their gold honestly and giving it to the poor, or making presents to the children, the pirates robbed ships. Then, as 'twas said, they buried their treasure. Lunatics and boys that read too many novels have ever since been digging in the land to find Captain Kidd's gold. Santa Claus does not like such people. Moreover, he was just as good to the poor slaves as to white children. So the colored people loved the good saint also. Their pickaninnies always hung up their stockings on the evening of December 6th. Santa Claus filled the souls of the people in New Netherland so full of his own spirit, that now children all over the United States, and those of Americans living in other countries, hang up their stockings and look for a visit from him. In Holland, Black Pete was very loyal and true to his master, carrying not only the boxes and bundles of presents for the good children, but also the switches for bad boys and girls. Between the piles of pretty things to surprise good children, on one side, and the boxes of birch and rattan, the straps and hard hair brush backs for naughty youngsters, Pete holds the horn of plenty. In this are dolls, boats, trumpets, drums, balls, toy houses, flags, the animals in Noah's Ark, building blocks, toy castles and battleships, story and picture books, little locomotives, cars, trains, automobiles, aeroplanes, rocking horses, windmills, besides cookies, candies, marbles, tops, fans, lace, and more nice things than one can count. Pete also takes care of the horse of Santa Claus, named Sleipnir, which goes so fast that, in our day, the torpedo and submarine U-boats are named after him. This wonderful animal used to have 8 feet for swiftness. That was when Woden rode him, but, in course of time, 4 of his legs dropped off, so that the horse of Santa Claus looks less like a centipede and more like other horses. Whenever Santa Claus walks, Pete has to go on foot also, even though the chests full of presents for the children are very heavy and Pete has to carry them. Santa Claus cares nothing about rich girls or poor girls, for all the kinds of boys he knows about or thinks of are good boys and bad boys. A youngster caught stealing jam out of the closet, or cookies from the kitchen, or girls lifting lumps of sugar out of the sugar bowl, or eating too much fudge, or that are mean, stingy, selfish, or have bad tempers, are considered naughty and more worthy of the switch than of presents. So are the boys who attend Sunday school for a few weeks before Christmas, and then do not come any more till next December. These Santa Claus turns over to Pete, to be well thrashed. In Holland, Pete still keeps on the old dress of the time of New Netherland. He wears a short jacket with wide striped trousers, in several bright colors, shoes strapped on his feet, a red cap and a ruff around his neck. Sometimes he catches bad boys, to put them in a bag for a half hour, to scare them. Or, he shuts them up in a dark closet, or sends them to bed without any supper. Or, instead of allowing them 11 buckwheat cakes at breakfast, he makes them stop at 5. When Santa Claus leaves Holland to go back to Spain, or elsewhere, Pete takes care of the nag Sleipnir, and hides himself until Santa Claus comes again next year. The storyteller knows where Santa Claus lives, but he won't tell. The goblins turned to stone. When the cow came to Holland, the Dutch folks had more and better things to eat. Fields of wheat and rye took the place of forests. Instead of acorns and the meat of wild game, they now enjoyed milk and bread. The youngsters made pets of the calves and all the family lived under one roof. The cows had a happy time of it, because they were kept so clean, fed well, milked regularly, and cared for in winter. By and by the Dutch learned to make cheese and began to eat it every day. They liked it, whether it was raw, cooked, toasted, sliced, or in chunks, or served with other good things. Even the foxes and wild creatures were very fond of the smell and taste of toasted cheese. They came at night close to the houses, often stealing the cheese out of the pantry. When a fox would not, or could not, be caught in a trap by any other bait, a bit of cooked cheese would allure him so that he was caught and his fur made use of. When the people could not get meat or fish, they had toasted bread and cheese, which in Dutch is geroosterd brood met kaas. Then they laughed, and named the new dish after whatever they pretended it was. It was just the same as when they called goodies, made out of flour and sugar, nuts, fingers, calves, and lambs. Even grown folks loved to play and pretend things like children. Soon, it became the fashion to have cheese parties. Men and women would sit around the fire, by the hour, nibbling the toast that had melted cheese poured over it. But after they had gone to bed, some of them dreamed. Now some dreams may be pleasant, but cheese dreams were not usually of this sort. The dreamer thought that a big she-horse had climbed upon the bed and sat down upon his stomach. Once there, the beast grinned hideously, snored, and pressed its hoofs down on the sleeper's breast, so that he could not breathe or speak. The feeling was a horrible one, but, just when the dreamer expected to choke, he seemed to jump off some high place, and come down somewhere, very far off. Then the animal ran away and the terrible dream was over. This was called a nightmare, or in Dutch a nachtmerrie. Nacht means night, and merrie, a filly or a mare. In the dream, it was not a small or a young horse, but always a big mare that squatted down on a man's stomach. In those days, instead of seeking for the trouble inside, or asking whether there was any connection between nightmares and too hearty eating of cheese, the Dutch fathers laid it all on the goblins. The goblins, or sooty elves, that used to live in Holland, were ugly, short fellows, very smart, quick in action and able to travel far in a second. They were first cousins to the K-abouters. They had big heads, green eyes and split feet, like cows. They were so ugly that they were ordered to live underground and never come out during the day. If they did, they would be turned to stone. The goblins had a bad reputation for mischief. They liked to have fun with human beings. They would listen to the conversation of people and then mock them by repeating the last word. That is the reason why echoes were called weak clank, or dwarfs talk. Because these goblins were short, they envied men their greater stature and wanted to grow to the height of human beings. As they were not able of themselves to do this, they often sneaked into a house and snatched a child out of the cradle. In place of the stolen baby, one of their own wizened children was laid. That was the reason why many a poor little baby, that grew puny and thin, was called a wijzielkind, or changeling. When the sick baby could not get well, and medicine or care seemed to do no good, the mother thought that the goblins had taken away her own child. It was only the female goblins that would change themselves into nightmares and sit on the body of the dreamer. They usually came in through a hole or a crack, but if that person in the house could plug up the hole, or stop the crack, he could conquer the female goblin, and do what he pleased with her. If a man wanted to, he could make her his wife. So long as the hole was kept stopped up, by which the goblin entered, she made a good wife. If this crack was left open, or if the plug dropped out of the hole, the she-goblin was off and could never be found again. The ruler of the goblins lived beneath the earth, as the king of the underworld. His palace was made of gold and glittered with gems. He had riches more than men could count. All the goblins and K-abouters, who worked in the mines and at the forges and anvils, making swords, spears, bells, or jewels, obeyed him. The most wonderful things about these dwarfs was the way in which they made themselves invisible, so that men were able to see neither the nightmares nor the male goblins, while at their mischief. This was a little red cap which every goblin possessed, and which he was careful never to lose. The red cap acted like a snuffer on a candle, to put it out, and while under it, no goblin could be seen by mortal eyes. Now it happened that one night, as a dear old lady lay dying on her bed, a middle-sized goblin, with his red cap on, came in through a crack into the room, and stood at the foot of her bed. Just for mischief and to frighten her by making himself visible, he took off his red cap. When the old lady saw the imp, she cried out loudly, "Go away, go away. Don't you know I belong to my lord?" But the goblin dwarf only laughed at her, with his green eyes. Calling her daughter Alida, the old lady whispered in her ear, "Bring me my wooden shoes." Rising up in her bed, the old lady hurled the heavy clomps, one after the other, at the goblin's head. At this, he started to get out through the crack, and away, but before his body was half out, Alida snatched his red cap away. Then she stuck a needle in his cloven foot that made him howl with pain. Alida looked at the crack through which he escaped and found it quite sooty. Twirling the little red cap around on her forefinger, a brilliant thought struck her. She went and told the men her plan, and they agreed to it. This was to gather hundreds of farmers and town folk, boys and men together, on the next moonlight night, and round up all the goblins in Drenthe. By pulling off their caps and holding them till the sun rose, when they would be petrified, the whole brood could be exterminated. So, knowing that the goblin would come the next night to steal back his red cap, she left a note outside the crack, telling him to bring several hundred goblins to the great moor, or veldt. There, at a certain hour near midnight, he would find the red cap on a bush. With his companions, he could celebrate the return of the cap. In exchange for this, she asked the goblin to bring her a gold necklace. The moonlight night came round and hundreds of the men of Drenthe gathered together. They were armed with horseshoes, and with witch hazel and other plants, which are like poison to the sooty elves. They had also bits of parchment covered with runes, a strange kind of writing, and various charms which are supposed to be harmful to goblins. It was agreed to move together in a circle towards the center, where the Lady Alida was to hang the red cap upon a bush. Then, with a rush, the men were to snatch off all the goblins' caps, pulling and grabbing, whether they could see or even feel anything, or not. The placing of the red cap upon the bush in the center, by the Lady Alida, was the signal. So, when the great round-up narrowed to a small space, the men began to grab, snatch and pull. Putting their hands out in the air, at the height of about a yard from the ground, they hustled and pushed hard. In a few minutes, hundreds of red caps were in their hands, and as many goblins became visible. They were, indeed, an ugly host. Yet hundreds of other goblins escaped, with their caps on, and were still invisible. As they broke away in groups, however, they were seen, for in each bunch was one or more visible fellow, because he was capless. So the men divided into squads, to chase the imps a long distance, even to many distant places. It was a most curious night battle. Here could be seen groups of men in a tussle with the goblins, many more of which, but by no means all, were made capless and visible. The racket kept up till the sky in the east was grey. Had all the goblins run away, it would have been well with them. Hundreds of them did, but the others were so anxious to help their fellows, or to get back their own caps. Fearing the disgrace of returning head bare to their king, and getting a good scolding, that the sun suddenly rose on them, before they knew it was day. At the first level ray, the goblins were all turned to stone. The treeless, desolate land, which, a moment before, was full of struggling goblins and men, became as quiet as the blue sky above. Nothing but some rounded rocks or stones, in groups, marked the spot where the bloodless battle of imps and men had been fought. There, these stones, big and little, lie to this day. Among the buckwheat and the potato blossoms of the summer. Under the shadows and clouds, and whispering breezes of autumn, or covered with the snows of winter, they are seen on desolate heaths. Over some of them, oak trees, centuries old, have grown. Others are near, or among, the farmers' grain fields, or, not far from houses and barnyards. The cows wander among them, knowing nothing of their past. And the goblins come no more. The end.